I have to tell our audience that, of course, you've been targeted. Your home was raided by the British police. Your computers and your electronic equipment, all of it was confiscated, and you've been subsequently threatened, potentially going to have to face the law over, I'm not sure quite what, really. So, since we recorded this interview, a British court has ruled that UK police must hand back electronic devices seized from the Electronic Intifada's Asa Winstanley in October 2024. Mr. Winstanley's solicitor, Tayyib Ali, said this ruling is a resounding victory for press freedom and the rule of law. The police's actions, raiding a journalist's home under the guise of counter-terrorism, were not only unlawful, they were an egregious abuse of power aimed at intimidating a journalist whose work challenged the political status quo. He went on to add, the Metropolitan Police must now undertake an urgent and transparent review of how they use terrorism legislation, especially against journalists. This case highlights a deeply concerning trend, that of counter-terrorism powers being weaponized against critics of the government policy and defenders of Palestinian rights. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we try to showcase those ideas, those thoughts, those voices which are often ignored by the mainstream media. Legacy media often has its own agendas, rooted in state agendas and possibly corporate agendas as well. Well, none of that here on the Deep Dive. We're focusing today on the issue of freedom of expression amongst the journalist fraternity and in terms of media as a whole. There has been a shocking rise in the number of journalists, for instance, that have been killed. Just in Gaza or in Palestine alone, we know that there are over 200 deaths over the last couple of years. That's an unprecedented number of journalists that are being killed essentially in a targeted way. That's not just the allegation, but it seems absolutely correct. And part of the reason for that is that, of course, the narrative needs to be controlled in the war on Gaza, but also the use of AI, the use of surveillance equipment in terms of being able to pinpoint and pick who and where people should be killed is also really, really concerning. You may have come across all sorts of systems like Pegasus, which have been talked about. We've talked the Lavender mechanism, which Israel has been using. These are just some new, very concerning issues in terms of journalism, in terms of freedom of expression, and the ability of state actors and military establishments to silence the voices that give us the truth. It has a huge implication on the way we receive news. And of course, these messages could be for the rest of the journalistic world as well. If journalists feel that they can't say what they have to say without being threatened with their very lives, then where does that leave us in terms of being able to get to the truth? With me in the studio today, I have Asa Winstanley, who is associate editor of the Electronic Intifada. Welcome to the studio.
Nice to be with you, Mohsin.
And I mean, I've started it off really in terms of a number of issues surrounding the way the state, media, journalists, etc., and outlets, as well as military and AI corporations, etc., might have this kind of overlap, which is very, very concerning for the freedom of expression, for our right to hear the truth. And you're no stranger to this. I have to tell our audience that, of course, you've been targeted. Your home was raided by the British police. Your computers and your electronic equipment, all of it was confiscated, and you've been subsequently threatened or are, potentially going to have to face the law over, I'm not sure quite what, really. So, I mean, I think contextually, going from dead journalists in battlefields and also journalists killed, not in the battlefields, for instance. There are journalists that I know in Turkey, for instance, who've had their cars mysteriously, pushed off the road and they've died. So there are all sorts of very nefarious manners in which journalists may well be threatened with, not just in the war zones, but otherwise. Richard Medhurst comes to mind as well, another journalist who's been harassed both at the immigration border here in Britain, but was subsequently also raided in Austria. These are just some cases that I can mention. I'm sure we'll talk about others during the course of the show. But tell me, first of all, about your particular experience. As a seasoned journalist with a very reputable outlet, the Electronic Intifada is hugely respected for its powerful journalism. What happened? Why were you raided?
Well, it was October the 17th of October last year. This is a big film, so 2024. And it was the crack of dawn, it was still dark, 10 to 6 in the morning. I was woken up from sleep by loud banging and ringing on the door. I went out into the upstairs corridor to try and find, I was all blurry-eyed. You don't really, when you're woken up rudely like that in the middle of the night, it's very confusing, discombobulating, and I think that's part of the intended effect. So I went out to the corridor to ascertain what was going on, and they started saying, "Police, open up the door." So it was very clear that if I didn't open up the door, they would have probably banged it down, knocked it down or something like that, or at least that's the impression they were trying to give. So so I let them in. After they said they had a warrant, they came in and they sort of took over the house. And they did quite an intense search. First of all, I was able to get legal advice over the phone.
While they were there?
While they were there. They didn't take every device in the house. But they took all of the main devices that I use for my journalism. So all my computers, all my phones, iPad, and a few other items. They took all of it, and they made it very clear that, and it's stated in the letter that accompanied the warrant, that the words used were, "We're aware of your profession." So they know I'm a journalist. They know they're targeting a journalist, and what they were saying to me in person was, "Well, we want you to specify which of the devices in the house you use for your journalism." And they also wanted me to give passwords and PIN codes, which I refused to do. I said no comment to that. After seeking legal advice, I did agree to specify which devices in the house were the ones that I used for my journalism, because otherwise it seemed most likely that if I hadn't have done that, they would have just taken everything in the house, and they may have raided, they might have taken my daughter's iPad and stuff like that, which they didn't.
What about that? Your family was there at this time in the house?
Yeah.
So that can't have been very much fun for your daughter or your wife, etc.
No. Well, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but no, the whole experience was not a very fun experience, to say the least. But I'm a little bit remiss to complain about that, because, as you said, this is in the context of a genocide in the Gaza Strip, where the Palestinian journalists are being targeted and killed, murdered en masse. As you said, more than 200 Palestinian journalists killed since October 7th, 2023 alone. And then even before that, there was Palestinian journalists targeted by the Israeli military. I think of Shireen Abu Akleh only the year before. Appalling, world famous Al Jazeera Palestinian correspondent in the West Bank. She was like the Kate Adie of the Arab world, you could say. Very famous all over the Arab world. And still she was deliberately targeted and murdered.
And that was on video. I've seen the videos, and there was absolutely no reason for them really to attack. It was very clear she was labeled as a journalist, as a press, and she didn't make any violent or any kind of actions that would warrant that. But that's been almost the norm, hasn't it now? It's become the norm.
The Israelis have made it the new norm, yeah. So now what it seems to be happening in the Western countries, the Western countries that support Israel, the Israeli model of targeting, cracking down on free speech has been rolled out to the Western countries. Germany, France, Britain, especially, and the United States too, increasingly. Thankfully, we're not at the stage of targeted assassinations yet, but certainly there is an increased, repression of free speech on the issue of Palestine for activists and journalists. In my case, in the end, what they did was, they strongly raided the house. They, strangely enough, didn't arrest me, which is a little bit unusual in the case of other raids that has happened on.
Sarah Wilkinson was the case, wasn't it?
Yeah, Sarah Wilkinson is a kind of citizen journalist, but I think they targeted her. They approached her more as an activist, it seems. Lots of other activists, especially Palestine Action, they've been cracked down very, very hard on, done very intense raids and arrested them. And even in the case of Palestine Action, put them on remand and used abused anti-terror legislation against them. And then later, when it comes to court, the anti-terror aspect is dropped because obviously they're not terrorist groups; these are non-violent organisations. But in my case, my status as a journalist seems to have afforded me a little bit of protection in the sense that they didn't actually arrest me or charge me with anything, which is very strange. But they were still able to take all. So what they did in the end was they took all of my devices away. As I said, they were in the house for about 3 or 4 hours, something like that. And and they're sort of implying. There's some legal details that I can't get into publicly yet for legal reasons. Hopefully, we'll reveal more about that in due course. But what I can say is that they are trying to imply that they could possibly charge me with something in the future. So what it's stated in the warrants is that I'm suspected of violating Britain's anti-terror laws. And I said, what's this about? What's the raid for? And they would only say, well, we can't get into it now on the date, but it relates to social media postings you've made. I asked them to specify which ones, and they wouldn't. So this is about literally my writing, my tweets, it seems. So, yeah.
So Counter-Terror Laws 2000 was where it all began. And at that stage, I remember when I was working in and around the counter-terrorism scene, because when it first came on the scene, everybody was supportive, saying, okay, we don't want terrorists here. We don't want people destroying our communities. But it seems as though steadily what it turned out to be was really just a method of expanding police powers and the ability to basically fan out and go beyond just simply terrorists, but actually now target British citizens who are simply doing their job. I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that as a journalist, you've got to speak about issues like Palestine, which are going to be controversial. You'd have to speak about organizations which are proscribed, the H groups, for instance. That'd be naturally a part of your journalist exercise. It seems a little bit like a little bit sort of arbitrary as to who and why and where they would pick you up. I've seen it on social media, for instance, where the fact checkers on FB or others, other sites, would get 30-day jails, bans. That's the very basic level of censorship that most of us have encountered. There was quite a draconian exercise of that. It seems to have softened up, and now they just seem to shadow ban people. That's another aspect of stopping citizen journalism or ordinary journalism. But yours, again, for the police to come that far, surely they should have some real evidence and reasons. Surely they should have approached you directly first. Raiding somebody's house rather than an inspector or an officer coming to visit you and asking you about these tweets. Surely that would be the way policing ought to go.
Well, exactly, and this is kind of the mystery of the whole thing right now, which we're, thankfully I do have a really good legal team, and I am being supported by the National Union of Journalists, so that's not something I have to worry about. But yeah, this is the great mystery we're trying to get to the bottom of, was if they had a problem with any of my writing, including my tweets, surely, they could have talked to me about it. And sought clarification, because as you said, so yes, it's these so-called anti-terror laws. They are incredibly broad and incredibly draconian, because the provisions that they were talking about in the warrant from the 2006 anti-terror law, which makes reference to it being illegal to support a prescribed terrorist organization, which includes some Palestinian and Lebanese armed groups, but what does supportive mean? We were talking earlier about as well. It's a matter of praising as well. That could be potentially illegal. So it's very difficult. If I state a fact about one of these. This is the chilling effect of the whole thing, because I'm being very careful on what I'm stating now.
Even now, right? You have to self-censor, I imagine, in your head.
It does have an effect. I mean, there's the example of one of your previous guests, Professor Hayam Brishith, who was at a protest in Swiss Cottage and gave a speech in which he stated that two of these prescribed organizations, in addition to the government of most of Yemen, the military forces of the government of most of Yemen, that Israel had been unable to defeat them. That was it. That's all he said. He said,
a fact.
Israel has been unable to defeat them. It wasn't saying that was a good thing or that it was a bad thing. It was just stating a fact. And the police honed in on that part. They were monitoring his speech and they arrested him, it seems, for that statement. Thankfully, it ultimately didn't go anywhere. He was held overnight, and then the whole thing was later dropped, and they did give him a notice of no further action. So that's something. But, this just shows the way that these laws are overly broad, very draconian, and they give these very broad powers to be used and abused by different governments. And as you said, this is not a new thing, although it's been going on for 25 years. Some of those powers have been there for 25 years, but they're now being really used increasingly, especially by the Labour government.
And you'd expect the Labour government to be the furthest from doing that, yet here we are. But let me stick to what you've raised, this issue of censorship. You're already having to think about what you say, rather than be what a journalist should be, which is to state facts and do it as truthfully as you can with integrity. You're having to now edit yourself live on camera. I guess we do that in life anyway, where we have to follow certain social norms. But this is really difficult. How is this going to impact your writings, and not just your writings? I'm just wondering. Electronic Intifada is quite a big outfit, relatively speaking, as a journalistic outfit, long-standing and reputation, has lawyers, as you say. But what about independent individual journalists? When they see somebody like you being raided, or Richard Medhurst, or any of these other, surely that's going to make them think twice as well now, in terms of what they're saying and how they're saying it.
Yeah.
And is that perhaps one of the reasons for perhaps targeting higher profile individuals like yourselves, that it kind of makes a point of it, makes an example of things, so that everybody else tones down whatever they're saying? And that's in itself then therefore is a violation of freedom of speech of individuals.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, I think that is very much the case. Look, we're a modest-sized independent media organisation, We work with a lot of freelance journalists all around the world, in Palestine itself, in Gaza specifically, but all around the world. And, we have a moderate-sized staff of editors and so forth within our team. But we certainly punch above our weight in terms of our impact and our reach and, our weekly live stream on YouTube and other streaming platforms reaches a very large audience. So, yeah, when things like what happened to me happen, it gets out there, word gets around very quickly. Something similar happened to my colleague, Ali Abu Nema, the executive director of Electronic Intifada.
That was in Switzerland, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, he was there to the invitation of local Swiss activist groups to speak about Palestine and the genocide in Gaza. And he was banned from entering after he entered the country. So he was then arrested and held without charge for 3 days and then deported from the country.
But no charges were brought and he wasn't given a reason why?
No. So he's actually working to challenge that in the Swiss courts right now. So that, again, we had a very worried weekend where we were trying to get him out of jail, basically, and the story went all over the world. And yeah, that has a positive effect in the sense that it rallied people to call for his release, and that helped put pressure on for his immediate release. But also, yes, it also has this other effect of, people will be aware that they've got to be careful what they say and careful what they do.
So it amounts to intimidation. It seems to me that this is very intimidatory in the way that they're rolling out the actions based around these counter-terror laws. And it seems as though that intimidation is targeted at a certain kind of viewpoint. I think I have to admit, everybody I've researched that's been targeted has views which are, first of all, pro-Palestine, and they are also against kind of totalitarian establishment sort of encroachment, or they're fighting for the freedom of to march or protest. Or these are the kinds of people that are being targeted. When I look at the record and say, okay, let me play devil's advocate, are they also targeting, for instance, journalists who support Israel in what is ostensibly now by the ICJ is being pretty much touted as a genocide? Yet there's been no action. I don't think, if we were to go and do our homework, I don't think we're going to find anybody from the mainstream media, the legacy media who I was talking about in the beginning of this show. I don't think any of those journalists, Mr. Jonathan Friedman at The Guardian, or any of the other, Mr. Piers Morgan, or any of these other mainstream journalists, when they try to push the support of Israel, which they clearly do in many of their shows and their writings, there's no means of going to them and saying, look, you're now also causing problems by supporting the killing of children.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to me a clear bias within the way the situation is being dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not being arrested. They're not being shut down. They're not being. It's the opposite. I mean, we've seen within the mainstream media that the problems really stem from the top. Of these institutions like the BBC, like the Guardian, and I think even I was talking about this in a public meeting in Bristol a few weeks ago with the journalist Jonathan Cook, who some time ago, many years ago, used to work for The Guardian, so he's seen it from the inside, and he's talked about how, he's written for many years publicly about his experience at The Guardian of reporting from occupied Palestine and being censored within The Guardian, and how the stories that question the Israeli narrative about how the Israeli narrative that they used to have, not so much now, the mask is kind of a lot more off now, but they used to have this narrative about, and it's still there to an extent, but about how the so-called Arabs, Israelis within within so-called Israel have equality and freedom within Israel. And a lot of Jonathan Cook's reporting, because he was based for many years in Nazareth, in the north of occupied Palestine, really debunked that and showed, for example, during the Second Intifada, with the killing of the peaceful protesters who were Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Israeli forces killed them, shot them down. And, all those kind of stories that he would try and get published in The Guardian were very often shot down within The Guardian. And there's this culture really of genuflecting and promoting the Israeli narrative. And Jonathan had an interesting perspective in this recent public meeting where he was talking about how some things have now changed within these mainstream media organizations and some things haven't. So what has changed is that the internal culture, even within the BBC and The Guardian, it's more contested, because the journalist, there's some very good journalists in these organizations who try and they push and they try and get the genuine stories out about the Israeli repression of the Palestinians. And there is this increasing dissent within these organizations. But what hasn't changed is the coverage is still overall just as bad, because some of that stuff maybe get through around the edges, but overall it's really censored and repressed. There was an example recently with Owen Jones's story for Dropsite News about growing dissent within the BBC over this issue of really pro-Israel enforcement and censorship by a very high-placed pro-Israeli editor at the BBC's website, which has millions and millions of views every month, and also has a wide influence on the BBC's news coverage. Any single story about the Middle East, and certainly of the coverage of Palestine, goes through this one pro-Israeli individual who works very, very closely. At least he works extremely closely with the Israeli intelligence agencies, especially the Mossad, the spying and assassination organization. And so, really, the Israeli narrative has infiltrated British media organizations in this way. So the dissent is there at the grassroots level, but in the management levels, it's completely repressed.
Well, that's something which I know Professor Miller has been or is doing quite a lot of research on. Lots of other people probably are as well, but I've been picking up on his narratives around the relationship between government, higher echelons of the media, and corporations. Because, of course, when we talk about the media, it's not just state-sponsored media, the BBC being one example, or RT for that matter, but it's actually this corporate sector where people would have thought there would have been independence because they're businesses and they want to make profit and they've got nothing to do with states or politics. That, in a way, should make them independent. However, it's been pointed out that the ownership of the Barclay brothers, I think there's only one living now, but for instance, Rupert Murdoch, it's not hidden that they are Zionists, that they support Israel, they are part of an establishment. And I mean, does it really go that far that the CEOs and of these huge corporations, and then the executives that run the show, the media, there is a connection at that higher level, of course, because the people who are funding them have a philosophy, have a culture, and they don't make any bones about it either in many cases. So are we really facing an entire, quite well-oiled machine at the top? And I have to bring Elon Musk into this as well now, because he obviously made the biggest splash over the last kind of 3 or 4 months or so, and made no bones about where he stood on many, many issues. And a lot of them seem very, very far right. And very dangerous in terms of the way they impact our society. So is that area needs to be explored. This idea of oligarchs, big money men who own news outlets, and then their relationship with governments and their ability to overturn even public opinion and turn it against governments. Are we at the point where we need to really study how that kind of power needs to be regulated?
Yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be challenged, So, I mean, I think that the only real way to defeat that is through independent media really is through reader and viewer supported media, such as yourself doing your YouTube channel, such as us at the Electronic Intifada. We've been going for 25 years. I haven't been there the whole 25 years, but yeah, there is a lot more openness. I mean, I think the internet is not the great utopia that it kind of claimed to be at the beginning, and the more time goes on, the clearer that becomes with how dominated the internet increasingly is, and to an extent always was, by these big, organizations, especially these big social media organizations with social media algorithms and so forth dominating everything, which are often very opaque and censorious. But nonetheless, I still think there is open avenues there for us to challenge and fight back against these dominant narratives.
But what worries me also, at the beginning I started talking about AI, and again, that links to big corporations and the state. And we know there was that famous case a few years back where Pegasus, the Israeli spy system, was exposed, and it was clear that MPs' phones were being tapped, and all sorts. Clearly, journalists' phones were going to be tapped as well. This is more kind of, again, more Israeli influence on the way our freedom of expression is being impacted. And there doesn't seem to be any punishment. There doesn't seem to be any sanctioning of Israel for that. There doesn't seem to be a hue and cry at the state political level, even though MPs were implicated in this, and presumably their private phone calls were being intercepted. Again, where is the accountability? How can we actually get more accountability and monitoring of this, and make sure that people's freedom online, on their phones, in gadget world, is honoured,
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't really know the answer, to be honest with you. But I mean, I think the Israelis definitely do try and market themselves as a useful kind of testing ground, proving ground for Western imperialism, for the interests of these powerful militaristic states led by the United States above all, and European states, and that their cyber warfare capabilities like Pegasus, the NSO group, Black Cube, all these kinds of sort of espionage mercenaries, essentially, and mercenary hackers, really, like the NSO group. Those tools that are developed by these Israeli organizations, which have very deep roots in the intelligence services in Israel, are then marketed abroad as useful tools for repression, essentially, by both Western governments and other governments around the world. But, as you said, like, these very same tools often end up being used against the interests of many of those Western governments. You mentioned the spying of MPs. Some of the Pegasus reporting showed that even the reporting done by The Guardian, which I think had some flaws, to be honest with you, but it did show that Pegasus was being used to spy on Emmanuel Macron, of all people, and other very high-level Western politicians. The Israelis are also viewed by intelligence professionals in the United States, supposedly the greatest ally, as one of the leading counterintelligence threats in the United States. If you go all the way back to the Edward Snowden disclosures, back in whenever it was, 2013, wasn't it? Something like that. All these leaked NSA documents, Israel was viewed as one of the top 10 threats to the American so-called national interests, to national security, by US counterintelligence. And the reason for that, and the only other people on that list were official enemy states like China, North Korea, and Venezuela, and along with them was Israel. Well, Israel was supposedly this great ally of the United States. So, what's going on there? I think it's a very interesting dynamic, and is something that is still often not very greatly understood. And of course, when you're dealing in the worlds of spying and counter-spying, a lot of it is very hard to prove until you get a whistleblower like Edward Snowden, and papers that come out and things like that with the what was revealed about the NSO group and Pegasus. But certainly Israel is a threat to many people the world over, absolutely. And it's not only against the Palestinians that it's a threat to, but Palestinians obviously are really the canaries in the coal mine of the oppression, because they're suffering the most in this most hideous genocide that's happening right now.
That's been coming up in a lot in my conversations, where it's almost like Gaza isn't just an issue of Palestine and land and ethnic cleansing and all the things that are now known genocide, but there's a bigger agenda for testing weapons, testing AI, testing surveillance techniques, seeing how intimidation works against individuals, and a huge psychological operation, basically, which is extraordinarily worrying. But coming more onto some possible solutions, I mean, I think we've mapped out that there is a really serious issue, and it's not just some isolated case, although we began with yourself and a few cases. The reality that I'll have to bring us back to is that over 200 journalists have been killed in Palestine. 70% of the journalists, I think, that were killed last year died as a result of Israel's genocidal, tactics. So in Gaza, and so they are clearly the fundamental culprits in this kind of rise in death of journalists, and therefore, of course, trying to stamp out the voices, if you like. But the Committee to Protect Journalists has come up with some things that they say must happen. They want. So one of the things that we can turn to is how to protect these journalists and how we should ensure that they don't get targeted. So, they want properly investigated crimes. They've said that publicly, there needs to be public acknowledgement and condemnation of the deaths of these individuals. They have to embed media freedom and accountability for crimes against journalists wherever it happens.
Yeah.
So there is beginning to be suggestions. I mean, there are groups which are beginning to talk about this, and I'll go into some of the other things they recommend. But who are the other, if you like, forces that carry some weight that could champion the protection of journalists, journalism, and the authenticity of voices on the ground? Who do you think should be responsible for this, leading this?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's only the United States government, and to a lesser extent European governments that could do this, and those are all sensible measures that should be done. And I guess it's just up to ordinary people to keep carrying on pushing for them to do so, although they show absolutely no signs of doing so and really doing the opposite. It's hard for us to expect the British government, for example, to do any of those things, to put pressure on and to condemn Israel for these killings of journalists, Palestinian journalists, when they won't even acknowledge that Palestinian journalists exist. Recently, not so long ago, in a discussion in Parliament, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, said that there are no journalists in Gaza. And, this was meant to be, I mean, he would frame that as that he was making a criticism about the fact that Israel doesn't let in Western journalists. But that it was such a giveaway that the fact that of his own racism and the British state's institutional racism, really, against Palestinians as a whole, that he doesn't even see Palestinians as existing, doesn't see Palestinian journalists as existing, he doesn't even think about them as valid journalists. And that's just really a reflection of, ultimately, of Israeli racism, really, that their whole narrative about that Palestinian journalists are not real journalists, they're like Hamas terrorists in disguise or whatever, kind of nonsense like that. And that therefore they can be safely imprisoned or killed, as they often are. I mean, if you put like one of the most recent Palestinian journalists targeted and murdered by the Israelis in Gaza, Hossam Shabbat, this very young guy, was only 23.
He died last week, less than a few days ago.
Yeah, he had his whole life ahead of him, and he was a war correspondent, and he was threatened over the phone by Israeli agents specifically to stop reporting, to stop doing his reporting, exposing the genocide in Gaza. And he didn't, and they targeted and they killed him for that reason. And now they're still trying to assassinate his character after his death. You know, if you post a condemnation on Twitter, for example, about him or other Palestinian journalists killed by Israel, you'll get a whole bot farm like in your replies saying, "Oh well, he wasn't a real journalist, etc., etc. He was just a terrorist." And it goes for any Palestinian journalist. So, you know, the infiltration of this Israeli racism and Israeli narrative into Western governments and Western societies is really insidious, and we have to fight back against it and challenge it in any way that we can, really.
Well, you raised the issue, the dark issue, which hadn't even come to my mind, about targeted killings, perhaps, of journalists as well, which haven't happened here. They've certainly happened as a result of Israel in that part of the world. I'll give the example of the pager terror, the mass murder in that journalists were targeted as well. Of course, the Lebanese resistance was targeted as well, primarily, but civilians were caught up in that. I could also look at another tactic, which I've just seen emerging this week, literally, where a demonstration against the war, a general demonstration against the war in occupied Palestine by Gazans themselves, 200 or 300 people, reportedly maybe up to 1,000, was then amplified as a narrative by Israelis and the pro-Israeli, media, Hasbara fraternity, as being something which was specifically against the H group. So they twisted it and turned it. But what really interested me was that they were targeting a journalist. And I don't remember his name, unfortunately, offhand, because it just occurred to me now. But that was another interesting thing, where they used a journalist, a well-known journalist in that region, in that area, and they said the demonstrations were targeting him. Now, whether that was a psychological operation set up to target this journalist who was well known for being against occupation and reporting from the ground again, and then putting the Gazans up against him, almost kind of trying to incite this notion of like a division and a kind of a sort of a problem, a conflict, which would be quite classic deep state tactics, if you ask me. But certainly, again, a journalist being used in a way which I haven't seen before, a journalist at the heart of a kind of psyop, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Israelis have always tried to orchestrate these kind of psyops and internal division within indigenous societies to, it's a classic, colonial tactic, isn't it? Divide and rule, either along sectarian lines, political lines, or whatever else, whatever other tactics can be used within the society.
And how about if they were to use that tactic, as you said earlier on, you said the things that are being done in Israel are then being rolled out in other societies. They could be done by the Hindutva, for instance, in India, against Kashmiris, for instance. They could be used here in terms of the society and the far right, for instance, and Muslim sort of, fraternity, which are a little bit on the extreme side. And you could create this polarization. If you use that tactic, you could exaggerate the polarization between society using narratives like immigration, and the refugees, etc. How likely is it that we would get the bad habit of Israel in terms of doing things which actually polarize us here in Britain? And they're already arguably happening in America already as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly possible. I think the British state already has a long history of doing such things as it is. There's the whole, and the United States and the NATO states in Europe, there's the whole history of Operation Gladio as well, with false flag operations. terrorist attacks and so forth against civilian targets in Europe by this. There's a whole long history there, but essentially these bombings were, such as the Bologna bombing in 1980, I believe it was, in Italy, which was portrayed to be a terrorist attack by a left-wing extremist organization, whereas actually it was orchestrated by a far-right organization in concert with the Italian deep state in order to number one, to discredit the left in Italy, the Communist Party especially, which had several times nearly won elections, and even though that part didn't work out, the second aim was to sow terror and to push the general public to rely more on the state for increased intervention in society and in elections and so forth. There's a long history of that, of all kinds of dirty tricks by the various deep states in NATO countries and the US. So Israel isn't unique in carrying out those kind of strategies. I think Israel, it has a mixed history in that regard, in terms of it is often failed to do that. Like, for example, the whole division that it tried to orchestrate between Fatah and Hamas, the Palestinian political and military factions, it had a degree of success, but it also failed to, for example, take over the Gaza Strip, like the whole back in. The protests that you mentioned, there's this kind of attempt to. I think, like you said, there are genuine protests. People are sick. Obviously, they don't want the war to go on, of course.
Sure.
And the protest signs really mostly have been saying things like they're just children saying we want to live, let in food and so forth. So really they're directed against the Israelis. But there was this attempt to kind of infiltrate by the media and by some individuals in the north of the Gaza Strip associated with certain factions who are trying to kind of infiltrate an anti-Hamas narrative. There's a long history of Israel trying to do that, and the United States, the CIA trying to do that in the Gaza Strip. And when Hamas won elections in 2006, they tried to overturn the result of those elections by orchestrating a coup. It was partially successful in returning Mahmoud Abbas to full power, the preferred interlocutor of the United States. The preferred Palestinian interlocutor of the United States. It was successful in the West Bank, but it wasn't successful in the Gaza Strip because Hamas stopped the local warlords of the Palestinian Authority from taking over. And so they've never really, I suppose the Israelis have never really forgiven that failure. And so they're still trying to orchestrate this and to stop ultimately the elected government of the Gaza Strip from coming back after this war. But I think a lot of things have changed since then. Hamas's political wing have said that they're willing to step down from government, but the question really is over the weapons of the Palestinian resistance, which I don't see them giving up voluntarily, especially not as Netanyahu has been trying to say that you have to carry out anti-Hamas demonstrations in the Gaza Strip, and then after you depose Hamas from government, we're going to carry on with the Trump plan and expel everyone from Gaza. So there's no incentive for anyone to give up their weapons in the Gaza Strip, and so for that reason and many others, I don't really see that happening.
That's a very valuable insight there. I'm going to round it off by just asking you the final question. What do you see in terms of the consolidation of freedom of speech and the defense of journalists who are able to do that. I mean, what does the public need to do? What does the government need to do? What do journalists themselves need to do to maintain the standards of freedom that we've had in the past?
Yeah, well, journalists have got to stick together, you know, even if we don't necessarily all agree with each other's positions or opinions on things. There has to be that freedom of speech to report on what we're reporting on without being under threat of being locked up for overly broad anti-terror laws, which are used and abused to suppress valid freedom of speech and factual reporting. And journalists have got a duty to speak out about that. And really, in Britain especially, they're really currently failing to do so, failing to stand by Palestinian journalists who are being picked off one by one by the Israeli genocidaires. And we just have to keep pushing for these things to change.
Asa Winstanley, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Deep Dive Perspective, and I wish you well in I'd say the targeting of yourself by the British establishment, and I hope that no further actions are taken and that you're allowed to express your opinions and views as a journalist and the facts, etc., on the ground without harassment, without intimidation, and without the fear of being locked up. It just seems a completely diabolical state of affairs that you have to be in that limbo psychologically and otherwise, and the fact that your family has to have had coped with that violation of their own privacy. So my sympathies to you and my regrets. And really, I have to say, I'm gobsmacked that I'm at a point where in Britain I have to start talking about freedom of speech. Not so long ago, there was a huge furore when Salman Rushdie was supported by the state for his right to write what he wanted, to say what he wanted, regardless of what the circumstances were. But that was a right which we would all say. And of course, there are lots of discussions about freedom of speech and the freedom to insult. And there are lots of discussions to be heard around this. But I would have thought that one thing which was sacrosanct was the right of journalists to be able to bring to you their factual, honest interpretations and investigations of what is going on out there. Otherwise, if that's not there, then how can you trust the news? How can you trust anything that anybody says on the media if they're not if they're going to self-censor or they're going to not say what they want to say because they're scared of being pulled up by the police? I think that's an unacceptable situation. I think anybody watching this program will empathise with Asa, who's just probably one of the minor cases of harassment that's now beginning to take shape. And we all need to think about how we can put a stop to this. We have parties in this country now who align themselves on such policies. And that, to me, smacks of totalitarianism and sort of borderline fascism in terms of the direction of politics and the preference of so-called democratic parties. And if all the parties are lining up in the same frame, then we don't have a choice, do we? Then that's another very huge issue for us in the future about whether we really value freedom of speech or not. And on a personal level, you on the internet, fair enough. I would accept that there have to be community guidelines, as you see on a lot of these social media platforms, and there have to be limits about insult and abuse and such things. But stopping people posting facts, journalistically researched facts, is that really where we want to go? I don't think so, but certainly you'll have your opinions. Write into us, put your comments on, please, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our fledgling Deep Dive Perspective channel so that we can bring you more fantastic interviews, just like the one that we've had with Asa Winstanley today. Thank you for watching this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective.